Thank you all for having me. It's an honor to be here. And I'll tell you, as any journalist would, I hate being the center of attention. I like my stories to be the center of attention. So I look forward to having a discussion about the craft of journalism in the age of fake news. But just to give you a little bit of an idea of the genesis of my career. So, of course, you all know about my latest work, but I really started off as a television producer before becoming a reporter in several markets throughout the country, the heart of America. So Missouri, and then Michigan, Indiana, Kentucky, before moving to the West Coast. And I feel like this gave me wonderful insight into the people within the heartland of the country. I believe very firmly and fundamentally, the idea of journalism is to represent the communities in which you serve. And so local news for me, versus whether it be newspapers, television, radio, I think is vitally important. And many times in the discussion around fake news, we bring up some of the legacy, the large organizations, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the assault President Trump has had on those organizations. And the conversations around those regional and local news organizations that serve the communities are often left out of the conversation. But in many ways, they're more important, vitally important, because those are the places where people receive their news. As was mentioned, you heard that I was a Knight Fellow at Stanford, and myself, along with my colleague Janae Desmond Harris, created a curriculum for journalists on the implications of implicit bias. And right after we were done with that, we were able to travel the country and present a workshop to journalists in newsrooms throughout the country. But very soon it became apparent that the narrative, the discussion is not necessarily implicit bias. Who's talking about bias news when fake news is what everyone is talking about? But I thought it was really interesting, this idea of what is fake news. Last night we had a wonderful discussion about fake news and this idea that there's definitely, this idea of fake news has been co-opted by the president to really talk about the types of news that he doesn't like. Maybe it's an article he doesn't like or a particular news organization that he doesn't like. But is that the true definition of fake news? Then there's this other component, which truly is fake or false news, and those are news articles and television programs that are satirical or are completely fake. And so I'd love to be able to talk about both of those things today. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having us here at the Melbourne Press Club. I keep thinking back to 9/11 ever since Donald Trump was elected. It's a little bit different because that was a terrorist attack and this was an election. But it had that same effect of totally upending our world and almost challenging all of our assumptions and causing us as the media to completely rethink what we were doing. I remember 9/11, 2001, I was a producer at a public radio station in Northern California, which is where I grew up. And very quickly, I decided that what I needed to be doing was to go to the Middle East, where, America was already at war in Afghanistan. We knew that George W. Bush would invade Iraq, and we knew that it was going to be the transcendent story of our time. And so I went to Jordan because Saddam Hussein was still the president of Iraq and I didn't want the authoritarian media tour. And then when the US went in and overthrew Saddam Hussein, I worked for a number of years as an unembedded journalist telling the stories of Iraqi people. Actually living in the Dulemi building, if there was anyone in this room who covered the Iraq War, it was right across the street from the Australian embassy, which was, in retrospect, a bad decision for me to live there because people kept trying to bomb the Australian embassy, which meant that they were trying to bomb my building almost incidentally and by mistake. So then I left. And I went back to the U.S. and I covered the treatment, as you heard, of military veterans and the way in which they were being left high and dry by our government. And then President Obama was elected, and he started to deal with some of these problems that I kept, like all good journalists should, just hammering away and hammering away and hammering away until we got some results. Then I thought, okay, the Bush administration is over, the Obama administration is winding down, time to take a step back. I'm going to go to Stanford for a year, I'm going to think deep thoughts, and then I'm going to go off in the world. And then Donald Trump was elected after I went back to work. And I feel like we're very much back in that same moment after 9/11 where we're trying to scramble and figure out what is the important story. And I don't think we have it yet. I don't think we have it. The big media like the New York Times and the Washington Post are doing a fantastic job of going after the huge stories like the Russia connection, the scandal of fake news, the problems with his business. It's a great story here in Australia, right, about the casino that he wanted to open here. That's all really important. But in the meantime, we all have to live our lives, right? We all have to live in a house and take the bus and like worry about putting food on the table. And how do we operate as journalists in this atmosphere where I've taken to call it like the daily news apocalypse? It's like there's a 9/11 type attack every single day. You know, like been here for the Walkley Foundation. I went into one forum and I came out and the president had pardoned the convicted felon sheriff of Phoenix, Arizona. He had banned transgender people from the military, and he had sent out like 4 other tweets. I can't even remember, but it all happened in like an hour and a half, right? How can we as journalists deliver vital information to the public when we can barely keep track of it ourselves? And I look forward to talking with you about getting your ideas and how we might do that together.
To begin, we all obviously know what's bad about the advent of Donald Trump for the media, but I'd like to start perhaps on a different note, which is it seems also have had some a bit of a silver lining in some respects. For example, I think it seems to me from this distance at least that it's had a really galvanising impact on the media. The media has suddenly woken up and been energised and realised that there's a big job to be done here and it needs to be done well and to be done energetically. At another level, and from a commercial level, which is vital, of course, to the survival of the media, is that media outlets and organisations, apart from those publicly funded ones, need income to survive. Well, for example, the evidence is that the New York Times and others have experienced a terrific lift in subscriptions because suddenly people realise that they need to know what's going on and they need reliable sources of information. So I might ask each of you perhaps to talk a little bit about that, and then we can move back onto some of the other themes as well.
Sure, you're right. It has galvanized the media. I guess I don't look at what happened with Donald Trump being elected as some sort of assault on the media, because I see myself as a civil servant. So what I'm doing essentially is providing news and information to the public in which I serve. And so thinking of it through that lens on the implications of President Trump being our president, I've definitely seen some of those big legacy organizations benefit. People want to. They're now more civically engaged than ever before. They are now interested in what's happening. They're now asking questions. They're looking up their legislators. They're paying attention to state politics. And we're there to cover those things and provide that information for them. So in that regard, I definitely do see that we have felt this sense of unity in a way that I haven't felt in many, many years. As Aaron said, the last time I felt it really was 9/11, just on a national scale, this sense of importance and providing information to people who vitally need it.
I started to call the election of Donald Trump, amongst other things, the Full Employment Act for me. like most other journalists, I've been feeling extremely insecure about my ability to continue to make my mortgage payments and live my life and raise my children. And now, suddenly, a lot of people value what I do in a way that they didn't before. And it's not just the New York Times and the Washington Post and these big media. It's also a not-for-profit investigative journalism outlet in San Francisco. I think that the key for the media in this kind of environment is to make sure that they're doing the work that the audience is craving right now and being relevant. And when I look around, I see some of the legacy media that are not stepping up and meeting this challenge continue to have financial problems. But the ones that have really taken the bull by the horns and are answering the questions that people want to be asked, we seem to be doing okay. And again, this is also like 9/11 and the 2003 invasion of Iraq. There was a huge boost of interest in news around a major news event. And it's up to us to kind of stand up to this challenge and do a good job, and then hopefully we'll be rewarded for it.
In what sort of ways has the Trump presidency diminished or undermined the position of the media, or do you see evidence of that, examples of that?
One note that I've noticed, so I've been a journalist for almost 20 years, and what I've noticed over time is that there has been a negative perception of the media for quite a while. And Donald Trump has just tapped into that in a way that really speaks to a certain type of American, but in many ways, it also speaks to the greater population and their thoughts and feelings towards the media. I always use my family as a measure, because my family, they're just a working class family from Michigan. They consume the news, but they're not news hounds. They're not constantly tuning in. They just read the headlines in the morning and maybe catch something before bed. They've had negative perceptions of the media since forever, with the exception of me, of course. They always say, well, not you, but the media. Well, they blame the media for everything. So, the media is spinning it this way, or the media is spinning it that way. And so I think Donald Trump has really tapped into that on a really deep level. So the biggest challenge, though, is those people who deeply believe that really being able to say what we do is of value to them. Because if you have someone who feels like what you're doing is not important, and that it's fake, it's not real, or that you have an agenda more often, they may believe that there are true elements in what you do, but ultimately it's spend some kind of way. It's hard to come back from that. I know that we've been trying in many ways to really set this tone of trustworthiness, but it's difficult when someone already has this deeply embedded idea.
I think that what's happening now is also a reflection of the internet, the rise of cable television like Fox News and MSNBC, and the segmenting and dividing up and balkanizing of news consumers in America and around the world that's happened with the weakening of legacy media. So when you publish a story, it's going out to a particular part of the community, right? The days when you put a story on the front page of the paper or you put it on television and everyone across the political spectrum got that information is gone, right? The people who are watching Fox are getting one set of information. The people who are watching MSNBC are getting another set of information. They're covering different topics. We could get into another discussion of how much of it is fake. But even just taking everyone, let's say everything is true, people are not involved in the same conversation anymore. And so one of the things that I always try to do with my stories when I publish them is tour them. Let's get this story on right-wing talk radio. Let's get this story on left-wing talk radio. Let's try to get in newspapers in different cities so that hopefully the story can bounce around and reach a broad cross-section of the audience instead of just one narrow segment that a particular outlet is trying to serve.
And that's the benefit of you working for a nonprofit news organization, because from there you can move those stories through different channels.
It is, but I mean, the way we're going, there is still fierce competition between outlets, but I think there's increasingly an understanding amongst commercial outlets that they need to partner up and work together. And maybe they're not going to work with their arch nemesis outlet, right? You won't see like the New York Times and the Washington Post team up on a story. But that doesn't mean that the New York Times wouldn't want to partner with a local outlet somewhere that might give them insight, or an ethnic media outlet that might give them access to a community, and that community might need the journalistic professionalism that the New York Times can bring, and then the New York Times reporter might need access, right? So there are so many different ways that this kind of collaboration can happen. And I think it is just absolutely necessary, not only from kind of like a business survival standpoint, but also, I mean, I'm a journalist. It means that my job is to get information together and distribute it to people. And if I'm not distributing it to a wide cross-section of society, then I'm not communicating effectively. I'm not doing my job.
I'll go to the room in just 1 second, but just one other point. I mean, part of these issues in terms of public attitudes towards the media, obviously there's some issues of blame perhaps on the media's part in terms of its relationship with the general population. And we touched on this across the table during the meal, but how could the American media have missed this phenomenal story, which was that Donald Trump was absolutely electable?
So I feel very fired up about this, because I mentioned to you all that I've worked throughout the country, and local news agencies in many ways have failed the folks that they cover, that they serve, because we're talking a lot about the New York Times and the Washington Post, but they can't cover the United States like the regional places and the local places can cover those areas. And so I think in many ways we've now woken up. We're seeing now much more engagement in that arena. My place of employment has now invested additional reporters to the legislative beat to watch the legislature. But over the last 20 years, we've seen a decline in that, and the importance of that. There used to be 15 reporters who covered the legislature at the start of the legislative session. And then a few years ago, it was just down to one person who'd go for the day. So we're now reinvesting in that type of coverage. I could go on, so I lost my train of thought. So I'll let Aaron go with it.
So, I mean, having spent many years covering military veterans, right? So in America, military veterans tend to break slightly Republican. Right? I mean, these are people who want a strong national defense, but they come from all over the country. So you'll see a traditional break of 55%, 45% Democrat, Republican. And in the maybe about 6 weeks or 2 months before the election, of course, like many journalists, I become friends with all my sources, right? And veterans in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Florida and these other states that went very narrowly to Trump. These are white men, working class, in their 20s and 30s, 40s. A lot of these people I knew had voted for Obama. Or they were, another one was kind of like, many of them were kind of like centrist Republicans, right, who you would never think would go for somebody like Trump. You'd think they'd be maybe the kind of Republican who might vote for Hillary. But as about 2 months out, they all started to be posting very heavily pro-Trump messages. And I started calling them up. I said, "What's up, Ryan?" This one guy, Ryan, and they're just like, basically they're pissed off people, right? They're so angry about the fact that they felt so neglected over so long, and the economic recovery in America has been very uneven, and the way people have been treated has not been up to their standards, and they're pissed off, and they didn't really think that much about who they were voting for, but they did not want Hillary because she was a representative of the establishment. And I kept hearing the same thing again and again, which is we're tired of Clintons and Bushes, right? Because you remember Jeb Bush had also won. We want someone new. They were attracted to drain the swamp, which is something that's kind of gone out of the president's vocabulary now that he's been elected. But that was a really powerful thing for them to hear a candidate say. And you know what I did with this information? Nothing, right? Like a lot of other journalists. I was like, oh, that's very interesting. Now I'm going to go back to my job, right? When what I felt like I should have been doing was stories about how Donald Trump dodged the draft, stories about how Donald Trump said veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder were weak and that people who committed suicide were weak, not like him, of course. And other stories based on the information and the unique position that I was in as a beat reporter in this area that could have helped educate this portion of the community about what was at stake for them in this election. But like most journalists, I just didn't take it seriously. And that's on me, and it's on all of my colleagues.
Okay, well, we'll take some questions.
Barry Donovan, Honorary Life Member of Media Alliance. Just to take up that last point that you made about Trump, as Mark referred to, Trump being a surprise suddenly getting up. From the stories that were run here, there seemed to be a huge failing by the Democrat Party in the election campaign. There's very little ever run here about Democrat Party policies, which this is what we will have for you in the Midwest and throughout all of those areas throughout the United States where people obviously were doing it tough and wanted to hear, well, what are you going to do for me? It's a very fundamental thing here in Australia too, but that message, there seemed to be no Democrat policy message that went out. It all fell back on Hillary, the personality of Hillary, and it seemed to be she was the one that guided it. But just to add to that, there was a very good story by a New York woman journalist that was run here earlier this year, which mentioned that in a post after the election, there was a meeting of the Democratic campaign crew, and Hillary was at it, and this woman journalist was at it on the fringe, and all the campaign workers were there, and all they were talking about were personalities. There was no analysis of why didn't we do this or why didn't we do that, no reference to policies. It all came back to personalities about why this and that. But that seemed to be a huge failing in the Democrat campaign, that there were very few policies that were put out to the people to say, yes, okay, we've got Hillary, we know what you think about the establishment, but these are the policies that the Democrat Party, a Democrat government, will do for you. There seemed to be a complete absence of that.
Well, post-election, there was lots of stories about how the differences in how Trump and Clinton ran their campaign, and they were very different. So Hillary almost never made her way through the heartland. She never made her way to small venues to talk with folks about the issues that were important to them. Trump, to his credit, did this. He actually went through America. If you look at, there was a map that showed where Hillary Clinton, her stopovers, they were always places where she had a huge financial support backing. So we're talking all along the coasts. She would stop in Michigan. She had a stop in Pennsylvania. But really, she ran her candidacy. Many people felt that already the assumption that she had those people already, so she didn't need to do that.
The thing about it that I find amazing is that a fair number of the Trump supporters in the face of this debate have really dug in. I agree with Tonya. I see the main problem is Hillary didn't speak to these people. right? She didn't go, she did not, she lost Wisconsin by a very, very, like 20,000 votes. She did not go to Wisconsin for 2 months before the election, right? So that's definitely part of it. I mean, nowadays I'm looking at, yes, there's a lot of anger and there's a lot of rage about Trump, going towards Trump, but there's also a lot of people who are really digging in. And their guy is in a corner, and they're going to help him punch his way out of a corner, and they're going to be right there cheering for him. And so everything has become very polarized. And that's a challenge if you are a journalist trying to communicate facts, to be operating in such a polarized situation.
Okay.
Tony Thomas from Quadrant magazine. Aaron mentioned how the press has been pursuing the Russian connection with Trump for the past year. Could I flash back about 3 years, and the Russians invited Bill Clinton to Moscow to give a speech, and they said, we'll pay you $500,000. Bill Clinton said, fine. The Russians are very generous, and they tipped in about $3 million to the Clinton Foundation. Not long afterwards, Hillary Clinton signed off saying she had no objection to Russian companies acquiring 20% of American uranium reserves. Do you think there might have been some Russian connection there? And why was the press not piling on to a flagrant issue like that?
You know, I'm not an expert on that particular story, but I will say this. The fact that the Clintons had been involved in many international dealings through their foundation made it almost impossible for Hillary to take Trump to task for anything. Because, yeah, I don't know if that particular allegation is true or not, but there are many things that are true, right? And so she was not in a position to make a credible argument. And I don't think that she understood how compromised she was.
Yeah, Belinda? Oh, sorry, John.
John Trevorrow is my name. Recently retired from News Corp and former Press Club committee member. Just a question that, Tonya, you mentioned earlier about the low esteem that people have for the media. I think what it seems to me that a lot of people will say that, but maybe the lie is given to that when people, they do consume news, whether it's online, whether it's Facebook, whether it's broadcast media, newspapers. So my question is, what do you think the silent majority? What do you think the silent majority view of journalism is? And the sort of the background of the question is that you'll hear a lot from people who are either for Donald Trump and therefore believe him when he talks about fake news, or people who are against Donald Trump and won't believe him. But what about that silent majority? What do you think their view is?
I actually think that, I mean, the media is vitally important, and so people consume it however they consume it. But there is a slice of distrust that has always been there. I do think that those who are more educated, they're more educated about the sources that they choose to consume news. It may not be a passive act to read the news or consume it. It may be a more active thing that they do, and so they trust the sources that they go to because they've actively sought them out. I do think that right now as journalists, we have the role of really taking our jobs seriously, and that we need to double down on the work that we are doing, and that we need to continue to churn out news that is relevant to the communities in which we serve. And I think that it's important when people come to us that then they are satisfied with what they come to. So to your question about the silent majority, I think it's just a mix of both. I think oftentimes when the president talks about fake news, and again, I go back to my family because they're like the average American family, they are not for Trump. I mean, they are not Trump supporters. But at the same time, when he says that, I think they think, well, you know, I don't believe everything the media says.
Belinda Hawkins from the ABC. You may not be experts on North Korea. I don't think perhaps many of us or any of us are, but What do you think of what's happened our time this morning and how this whole North Korean story is going to play out for ordinary reporters as well as expert reporters?
I just hope that the whole idea of nuclear weapons in the beginning was that they would never be used because everyone would die. And I just hope that, the North Korean regime feels that way, and we do have somebody on the other side in Donald Trump who's a little bit less even-keeled than the average American president. But at the same time, I mean, I'm not a North Korea expert, but I've been, I've reported in Korea and I've watched this story unfold over 15 years. And it seems like one of these stories that the more things change, the more they stay the same in a certain way. I mean, I remember when George Bush put North Korea in the axis of evil, and we were all worried about war, and then it just kind of puttered on for, so it's not one of the 5 things that keep me up at night right now.
I mean, because the idea is that it's the end of North Korea. It's the end of the world as we know it if that action were to be taken. And so I think our moral code just believes that there would actually be that idea and understanding that if there was attack on America, that would happen. I know, right? What are the 5 things that keep you up at night, Aaron?
Oh, gosh. Let's see. What is like the things that like I worry that if I go to bed it will have? I'm worried that America could slip in a fascist direction and we could start having police rounding people up in my neighborhood and throwing them in prison. And the pardon of Joe Arpaio hints in that direction, as do some other pieces of news. I'm worried about a war with Iran. If you look at the people surrounding Trump, there are the real saber rattlers, and then there are the professional generals like James Mattis and H.R. McMaster. But the one thing that they all have in common is that they all have a worldview where Iran is the big enemy who's spreading international terror. I don't know if that's exactly correct. I don't think it is based on my own reporting. But I think that they are dying for a provocation with Iran. We actually just saw a story earlier this week that the CIA was being pressured to change intelligence to get us out of the nuclear deal that President Obama made. I mean, where have we seen that movie before? So that keeps me up at night. Those are probably the 2: mass incarceration of my neighbors and war with Iran.
That was quite terrifying. I was wondering if I could ask about media ownership. We had an announcement yesterday that CBS will be taking over one of our main free-to-air networks, possibly pending approval. Can you, I guess, give us some thoughts on maybe CBS and then just media ownership in general?
I feel like, you speak as well, Tonya, I feel like in America, we don't have this dynamic that you have where you have a couple of rival companies. We went through a period of tremendous media consolidation in America. We have fewer and fewer companies owning newspapers. We have fewer and fewer companies owning television networks. But at the same time, we also have BuzzFeed and Vice and all these other media outlets that are attracting incredible followings that are outside of this system of media consolidation. And so this is one way in which the disruption of the media has been quite positive, I think.
I agree. I was just going to say that it's a different system, but we have seen the merging of independent news organizations within a particular market, which is concerning because ultimately when you talk about choice, that is what we have in America when it comes to your choice on the news that you consume. And if it's all coming from one place, where's your choice in that?
Yeah, Kilvington.
G'day guys, my name's Noah, I'm from Kilvington Grammar. Just a quick question. The youth is quite tolerant of media these days, and I was wondering what your views would be on fake news perhaps slipping into Australia anytime soon, and if we would fall for that sort of argument?
So I heard, and I see the expert in the room now. Last night we had a discussion around fake news and the definition of fake news, and it's very important to make that distinction. So when you say fake news infiltrating Australia, can you be a little bit more specific in what you mean?
I mean, in the sense that the calling out, like what you mentioned, how your family says they don't agree with sometimes media and the way they twist things. Do you think that any government, the Australian government, might be doing that sort of thing soon, saying that it's fake news?
Aaron, do you want to?
I mean, you know your own political system better than I do. One of the things that is important difference is there's a difference between stories that are completely made up, like the Pope endorses Donald Trump, versus stories with an ideological agenda, and that's a really important. Both of them are important to watch, and you all are living in Australia and know better than me the risk that either of those will become more ascendant than they are now.
If I could just ask another question. The satire has been a big thing, and I think it's been a defensive mechanism for a lot of people to respond to, who are struggling to respond to the Trump presidency. But I guess there's also a bit of a fake news overtone here, because part of the satire is faking. Although Alec Baldwin, I think, said the other day that Trump was beyond satire, although I think Phoenix sort of drove him back into the suit. But what do you feel about this phenomenon, the satirising of Trump? Does it? Yeah.
We're not as ahead as it is you all are. So you're used to satire and you understand it and you know it when you see it. Americans aren't as savvy when it comes to that. We take news pretty straight. And whether or not you believe there is an ideological agenda or not, a lot of people are confused when they read satirical material. If you go on Facebook, I don't know how many times my Facebook feed I see that people are sharing satirical news articles as if they're truth. And it's only until someone brings it up, have you investigated that website? Have you gone a little bit deeper and you see that it's not true, that they actually understand that it truly is satire?
I think humor is incredibly important. One of the big stories that I broke in the last decade was about the tremendous numbers of American veterans who were waiting for disability benefits. Almost 1 million veterans that come home from Iraq and Afghanistan and were wounded and couldn't work and were being told by the government to wait to get benefits. And they were ending up homeless. I mean, so many tragic events. And I did a story, and it had a number of impacts, one of which was that 67 U.S. senators wrote a letter to President Obama demanding change. There were congressional hearings. The New York Times did an editorial where they specifically called out the president and cited my story. And all of that was helpful in driving change. But the most helpful thing was that Jon Stewart decided that it should be big news. And he created this segment that he did regularly called the Red Tape Diaries. And he seized on all the funniest parts of my reporting. Like, for example, one of the things that I uncovered was that at the federal building in North Carolina, where they processed veterans' disability claims, there was so much paperwork that a government auditor found that it was causing the building to collapse under the weight of this paperwork. And so you all laugh, right? It's true, but you laughed. And so imagine what a comedian can do with this day after day. And the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back was not the letter from the 67 senators, and it was not the editorial in the New York Times. It was this, he gave the whole show over for 1 week where he sent a bunch of veterans into the VA records, like the federal building in New York, where his studio was, and they all showed up and they said, "Can you please find my file for me? Like, I keep calling, I keep emailing, find my file." And they just like sat in the waiting room and they did all kinds of other things, and it was like a little mini funny documentary. And anyway, the very next day, the Secretary of Veterans Affairs ordered every single employee in this agency, has 400,000 employees, to work overtime 30 hours of overtime a month. And within 6 months, that problem had been solved. And it was all because of Jon Stewart. So, so it's so important because it makes it accessible to people who might not be reading these other outlets.
Yeah, David. No, it's not on.
Yeah, David Polton from Inter-Ellison, thanks for being here today. One of the structural differences, I think, between our media and yours is that we have a very large and some would say unduly dominant publicly funded, government-funded broadcaster in the ABC. And you guys are both in publicly funded broadcasting or media, which is, we understand, a much lesser influence, if you like, in the American scene. But Aaron, you mentioned that one of the side effects of the Trump ascendancy was that you thought that things would be more secure in the future. I wonder if you'd comment on what you think the future is of public media in the US, and where's the money going to come from? Do you ever see a time when the government, perhaps you know, the President Sanders presidency or whoever replaces him, would think that yeah, it's a good idea to maybe put some money into the ailing fourth estate?
Well, this is a real issue. So President Trump has already said that he's slashing money to no longer fund public radio stations throughout the country. And what this does is it affects those smaller stations in the country. So I work for the San Francisco station, and prior to that I worked in Boston. Those are the two wealthiest, I would guess you would say. The majority of their funding comes from their members, who are members. So every public radio station has members that fund, but some receive more funding from the government than others. So our funding is 9% of our total budget comes from the government. So we'd be okay. But some of those smaller areas, they'll be completely decimated. They'll no longer have public radio or public television in those news markets. So it definitely is a concern. Is that the question that you asked me? Yes. The thing about it is when you do something, when you slash money, it's hard to bring it back. And if it becomes a 4-year deal where those places that once had public radio and television stations no longer have them, and we're talking 4 or 8 years later, it's just the talk is just starting to happen where it's reinstated. It's already been decimated, and it's hard to bring that back. It's hard to bring all of the infrastructure back. So it's a major concern for me.
I would just add briefly that the Center for Investigative Reporting, where I work, is a not-for-profit, and we don't get any money from the government. So everything is coming from charitable foundations and individuals who want to donate money, corporations who sponsor our content. And even where Tonya is working in public broadcasting, the government contribution is becoming less and less of a factor, and these other parts of the puzzle are becoming more and more important. And a lot of public media broadcasters are in the process of planning almost as if that money will go away, given the political environment.
I'm surprised we've got to 1:53 without this question being asked. It's the impossible question, but we need an answer. What is going to happen? Will Trump survive? Will he be impeached? What comes next?
So I'm going to tell you something, and I'll try not to be emotional about it. Yesterday, if you had asked me that question, I might have laughed and then said, okay, we have no idea. But this morning, there was a news conference. I woke up to the president talking about the pardoning of Arpaio, and he mentioned how he made this decision on Friday because he wanted to tweet it out before the hurricane hit, because he knew that there would be higher ratings, that they'd receive higher ratings on the Arpaio being pardoned than later, because the hurricane would take over southern Texas. And we're talking about people's lives. And we have a president who is on television talking about ratings. So at this point in my career and as a human being, just as a human being, forget being a journalist, it's really hard to say, I haven't been able to follow today the outcome of that, if there is backlash, because it seems that no matter what President Trump says, there truly isn't a standing up and a rising from Americans to say, this is enough. So what's going to happen? I don't know. President Trump said during the campaign trail he could walk in the middle of the street and shoot someone and he'd still be elected. So, sorry to down everybody, but I have to say I have no idea. I'm sure that Aaron will give you a much more eloquent answer.
That was pretty eloquent, and now I'm rethinking my whole moral universe after that. You remember before I was talking about the veterans that I was talking to during the election campaign that surprised me that they were voting for Trump. Even despite what Tonya said, they're still with Trump. I mean, I haven't checked today since these latest comments, but last time I checked in with most of them, like a week or two ago, they're still with the president. It seems like members of Congress are not, at least at this time, inclined to move towards any kind of impeachment or anything like that. So I don't know quite how to approach it as a journalist. On the one hand, I say to myself, this guy's going to be president for 4 years. You can't kill yourself. They're going to need you tomorrow, right? You need to be available tomorrow and the next day to continue to do your work. Sometimes I think we could all be dead tomorrow. So, anyway.
Oh, Aaron, you were supposed to give us something to like.
I know, but that's, sorry.
John Masanauskas, Herald Sun. You touched briefly on the mainstream media missing the election result,
Yes.
but I seem to remember the mainstream media was very much, didn't take him seriously and was very biased in some ways. Obviously, since his election, there's been a circus, so they've had a field day. To what extent was the mainstream media responsible for what's happening today, given their coverage?
Well, the Poynter Institute, which is a nonprofit journalism institute, actually took a look at this and found that he was receiving, when you talk about the amount of coverage to Hillary Clinton, it was something like 60% to 40%. So he was getting much more coverage because he was doing much more outlandish things. So there is an element of that in many ways we might have contributed to him getting his message out in a way that resonated with voters.
Yeah, I think there's no question. CNN broadcasted early in the primaries many of his speeches in their entirety, which was not something that was available to any other candidate. There was one famous instance when Hillary and Bernie were really going at it, and Bernie was speaking, and they were showing an empty podium where Trump would soon speak. And this is how he was able to reach a tremendous audience and convince people to vote for him, even though Hillary had much more money, because he was getting so much free media. As famously said, all publicity is good publicity. It wasn't all positive for him. A lot of it was negative, but it did crowd out some of the other voices. I think what happened, was in the beginning, in the first period, when he was knocking out those other Republicans, it was almost like a circus atmosphere kind of coverage. As the campaign got more heated, there was some very, very negative coverage of Trump. And I would agree with you that it did not achieve the result that many of those media personalities were hoping it would, that there was a backlash against it. I would agree with that.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Yeah, hi. I'm Stefan Kofi, originally from Ghana. I've been...
Oh, I'm sorry, could you speak up, please?
I've been living in Australia the past 4.5 years, and my question to you guys is, how would you describe the relationship between the Western media and third world countries? Because what I see with the media here, there's a lot of good things happening in countries like China, India, and Africa. And all I see is a media frenzy here. Every time I see news from the third world, it's just about to, I don't know how to describe it. It doesn't seem to be too good. So I want to know from you guys, how would you describe the relationship between the media and places like China, Africa, and India? Thank you.
Yes.
I think that the American media tends to be pretty parochial, even more so than the Australian media, especially now with President Trump's daily news blitz. It's harder and harder to get any news of any kind out that is not associated with those events. And so one of the things that we're losing is information about parts of the world that are not North Korea or somehow a threat, perceived or real, to the United States. Countries in Africa, regular news out of China and India and South America is another thing that's suffering and being squeezed out by the pace of events that we're dealing with.
And it's unfortunate because Americans, as Aaron said, we're already parochial. We really weren't voracious international news consumers to begin with, but there at least was more space to be able to have that news in the regular news cycle.
But there's one more thing. But I think a lot of people who live down here are seeing the rise of China and India, and they get a lot of fright and stuff. But also, like as I'm saying, it's the way the media portrays these countries, because I believe in Africa, and I believe that Africa will overtake China and India. And if the West is not feeding its people the right news from Africa, there's countries in Africa doing exceptionally well, like Rwanda, Nigeria is taking over, a lot of good things. But here I am. Every time I see a story about Africa, it's a bit still like seeing 10 people on a migrant boat, The media is always happy to look at a bit of downfall, like it happened with the Chinese, we put them down so much. I remember growing up seeing China, they were polluted, they were very poor, their noses were bleeding, and all of a sudden, China is a power. So once again, you realize that Trump has a very good point there, in the sense that we've been fed all this news. China was this, they eat dog meat. I remember growing up in Ghana, every time I heard about China, it was negative. So how are we going to begin to make sure people on this side of the world get good news about developing countries?
Just briefly, it's interesting. I feel like America is a strange place right now around issues like this, because on the one hand, you have a president who's demonizing China on the stump and can't even pronounce China, right? But on the other hand, you have a country that's increasingly diverse, right? I live in San Francisco, California. Chinese Americans are the largest ethnic group in my city. The Indian community is the fastest growing immigrant community in the United States right now. It's growing faster even than the Hispanic community. So we in California are relating to this information in an entirely different way than people in parts of the country that are not as diverse. And news reporters like myself and Tonya, who live in California, are reporting it in a different way than the people in the Beltway in Washington, D.C., who are just following President Trump. And I imagine you're seeing some of those similar dynamics here in Australia because you also have an increasingly diverse country as well.
It's an important question that you're asking, and it really takes some deep reflection on the part of news agencies. We, as you know, we're part of the Knight Fellowship, and there was a colleague of ours that was a Knight Fellow, Craig Timberg, and he was a foreign correspondent in South Africa for many years. And he talked about how there was so much news happening, and he was churning and churning stories, and then one day his editor said, look, we can only take so much news from that area. Americans just don't care. And it was disheartening to him because he knew that the news that he was gathering there had great implications for America. And also, he wanted to be able to give the nuanced, multidimensional stories of a region that was vitally important.